I'm Kathy Panoff, Director and Associate Dean of Texas Performing Arts, and I'm delighted to be here with my friend and colleague, Dan Welcher, who is Professor of Music in the Butler School of Music. He also directs the New Music Ensemble. Welcome, Dan.
Thank you, Kathy.
Dan, as you know, Texas Performing Arts received a very generous grant from the Mellon Foundation, and one of the components of that grant was the commissioning of new work. And one of those pieces that we are commissioning over the next 3 years is written by you. Before we talk about the piece specifically, I'm kind of curious to know your feeling on the importance of new work in the music field.
Oh my God, well, you just pushed my hot button, of course. It's the most important thing there is, and that's the composer in me speaking, but it's also the audience member in me speaking. I'm much more interested as an audience member in Austin in concerts, dance, plays that have something to do with now. And I will always patronize those venues that offer me that. So I'm very excited about the fact that Texas Performing Arts is caring so much about this. And you have a long history of commissioning before you even came here, contemporary composers, and quite successfully.
Yes, but I have done it pretty much my whole life, starting when I was in music school, and I used to play in reading ensembles for composers just so I could straighten them out on what a flute player could or could not do.
You would have been a nice asset to the New Music Ensemble, which is my job here.
Absolutely. The piece that I've commissioned you for is a piece with a purpose, believe it or not. I've commissioned you to write a piece for 2 string quartets. The exciting thing about that form is 8-stringed instruments often sounds 3 times as large and robust as just a string quartet. So the sound, from not only a compositional perspective, but also from an audience perspective, is very lush and has lots of opportunity. The other issue was the fact that you and I both know there are very few string octets or double quartets written in the repertoire. There's a couple that are very famous, but certainly no more than 3 that are well known and performed. What was your reaction when I asked you to write a double quartet?
Fear. Fear and trembling. Well, you actually asked me to write for 2 world-class ensembles, the Miro Quartet and the Shanghai Quartet. And that was a daunting thing to think about, because either of those groups would have been easy to write a killer quartet for. I would have enjoyed that. But to put them together on the stage, to have them mingle and maintain their own identities at the same time, and show off, which is what I wanted them to do, was what made it difficult. And so I decided to capitalize on the differences and to keep them separate on the stage.
Dan, before you really were a faculty member in composition, you were a faculty member here in bassoon, which is a wind instrument, and now I've asked you to write for string instruments. I'm curious about the evolution of a composer beyond his own expertise in his own instrument, and for you personally, what was the learning curve, and what is the sort of approach you take to an instrument that is not your own?
That's a great question. I was a professional orchestral player for 25 years, and I think 1982 was the first time I even tried writing for a string quartet. I had already written a dozen orchestral works, and I knew the strings that way, but not as chamber musicians and not as soloists. And my first attempt at writing for string quartet was a piece for clarinet and string quartet, and I started right at the top. It was written for a group in residence at Yale at the time called the Muir String Quartet, named for the naturalist John Muir, and the clarinetist Joaquin Valdepeñas, who was principal of the Toronto Symphony, and it was a 30-minute piece. So I dove in, and I did a lot of study and a lot of practice, and the piece was careful writing. The first real string quartet I got to write was a commission from the National Endowment for the Arts for the Cleveland Quartet. And for that one, I pulled out all the stops and I took some chances. And they loved the piece, and they toured with it for 3 years. I've written 2 quartets since then, and I find that I just adore the medium. If I could start over again, I'd be a cellist.
The year in which this premieres is actually the 100th anniversary of the premiere of the Rite of Spring, which in the music world, in the dance world, and in actually arts and cultural worlds was sort of a seminal moment.
And everybody's favorite scandal, too.
Yeah, it is everyone's favorite scandal, throwing tomatoes and all. And I said to you, if you're so inclined, because as a commissioner, I hope to give the composer a pretty wide berth, but also wanting to have a sense of time and place, too, when we're writing something. I did mention the centennial and said, if you feel so inclined, feel free to invoke any aspect of that story, of that music, so to speak. And I'm curious how you approached that, or if you did approach it.
I did approach it, and I approached it both in the scenario that I made up, which is not something I will tell people. It was just to help me write this music, and in the actual musical language. I decided not to quote Stravinsky directly. For one thing, I don't feel like getting sued, but to use the idea of rival gangs as a starting point. And you know, there's a famous dance in the Rite of Spring called the Games of the Rival Cities, where it's a very fast ball, and I remember seeing a ballet troupe do this. I think it was Welcher Ballet in the 70s, where they actually had men with naked chests and war paint running across the stage, jumping in the air and colliding on beats. And I never forgot that. I thought, this is how this should be staged, you know. It's really savage, it's really wild. I decided that because I was dealing with two tribes, two rival gangs, String Quartet A and String Quartet B, that I could approach the writing of this piece that way, have them face each other on the stage rather than all together mixed up like a salad, and have individual musical identities for Quartet A and Quartet B. In my mind, Quartet A invokes the god Apollo, and Quartet B invokes the god Dionysus, one being about thinking and careful processing of information, and the other being all about sensuality and feeling. And it's interesting that once I decided to tell people this is what I was doing, everybody wanted to know, well, which quartet is which, and each of them, independently of the other, figured it out. So number one, Quartet A is the stylish, elegant Shanghai Quartet, which is to take nothing away from the Miro Quartet, B and A not being superior or inferior, just different, for their ability to be earthy and really get down in there and do some serious digging in the dirt. And so the music, I wouldn't want to say it's really black and white that way, but there is a lot of juxtaposition of mood and atmosphere.
Since Rite of Spring is a sort of seminal dance work and a seminal orchestral work, were you inspired by any particular choreographer or dance that you'd seen?
Yes, and as I said, even though the Rite of Spring was the jumping off point, it's the Balanchine-Stravinsky ballets that followed it that I was really looking towards. Two in particular, Apollo Musajet, Apollo and the Muses, and Orpheus, which were both really very different from Stravinsky. In fact, I remember being in high school when I was first learning this music, being crazy about the Firebird and Petrushka and the Rite of Spring.
Weren't we all?
Yes, and then going to the library and taking out records to see what else this guy wrote. And the next thing I took out was Pulcinella. And I thought, well, sounds like Petrushka, Pulcinella, it'll just be the same. It was so different, based on music by Pergolesi and sounding old-fashioned with a little twist, maybe a little spice. And at first, I didn't like it. And apparently, neither did some of the critics back then. They thought Stravinsky had really gone over the cliff with his style change. But then it sort of found itself, and he wrote for 15, 20 years in this style, this neoclassic style. And it was the way that he was able to, with Balanchine, stage abstract ballet, not really story ballet. Orpheus has a story, but it's told through sectional dance. These 6 dancers come on and do this for a minute and a half. Then these 4 dancers come on and do this for 1 minute of very fast, intense stuff. Then the principal male dancer and the principal female dancer come out and have a pas de deux. That kind of thing that really harks back to Tchaikovsky, but isn't telling a story, is the way I approach this.
Believe it or not, people may not know that you sort of have to make a decision on what to call a piece. You know, it could certainly be Welcher, String Octet, number 1, because it is your first double quartet octet, yes. Right? Yes. But you and I talked about this a little bit, and have you come up with a name?
I have, and it's a long process. In fact, I'm still not used to saying it. It's Museon Polemos, which is Greek, kind of a made-up, mashed-up Greek word, which means War of the Muses. I was looking for titles that would bear witness to the fact that these are rival quartets that are duking it out on the stage. And I don't want to mislead anybody. This is not violent, crazy music. It's elegant music. It's written for two really good string quartets. But there is a lot of anything you can play, I can play faster. Anything you can play, I can play higher. That sort of thing. Oh, you thought that was good? Listen to this. And I do have whole sections where one quartet plays all alone, answered by the other quartet, and then they do something together. So there's a lot of back and forth and stereo action in the piece.
Well, I'm certainly looking forward to it, and thank you so much for being here.